what we are seeing now is a culture war, essentially, teetering on the brink of being a real war.
That's the verdict of top podcaster Gabriel Gatehouse on the political battle and the actual battle going on in Los Angeles over immigration. We'll discuss the implications on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Well, let's discuss it now because we're joined from Washington by BBC News chief presenter Sumi Somaskanda. Hello, Sumi.
Hi, Adam.
And here in the studio is Gabriel Gatehouse, presenter of the award-winning podcast, The Coming Storm. Hello, Gabriel.
Hello.
Multi-award winning?
No, only one award. I was actually, it's struggled so much to achieve an award that I actually kind of would rather it didn't, so that it could be like a cult thing.
Oh, it's more than colours. It's got a wide listenership.
Oh, it does have a wide.
So anyway, right, we digress. Right, Sumi, I have to. I hate saying, I'm a bit confused about what's actually happening, but such as the kind of fog of confusion around what's happening in Los Angeles, could you just spell out for us what has been going on over the last few days? Who's kind of fighting who here over what?
Yeah, it is pretty complex. So, the confusion is warranted, but we have to go back a few days. On Friday, we saw Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, ICE agents, carrying out enforcement operations in Los Angeles and a few different locations, but particularly in neighborhoods with a heavy Hispanic population. For example, Paramount, which is in LA County. It's not even in Los Angeles City proper. Carrying out enforcement operations to detain people who are undocumented in the country. And when word spread that these operations were taking place, people came out to protest. Now, the backdrop against this, of course, is that President Trump has vowed to speed up and step up deportations of undocumented migrants in the U.S. Well, Los Angeles, of course, has a long and deep history of particularly Latino immigrants, but also Asian American from all over the world. If you've been to Los Angeles, you'll know. So, the community reacted quickly. There were some skirmishes and scuffles with these ICE agents on Friday that continued into Saturday. From what we know from Los Angeles police, from the governor, from the mayor, Karen Bass as well, things had calmed down mainly on Saturday. But the images of those scuffles or reports of those scuffles prompted President Trump to say he's sending the National Guard in to, quote, quell unrest and also to bring law and order back to Los Angeles. That was an order that he made without the explicit consent of the governor. In fact, Governor Gavin Newsom said, we have things under control. So on Sunday, things really started to kick off. You can imagine, there had been some limited and isolated, and if you guys have been to Los Angeles, you'll know Los Angeles is a massive city. So we're talking about a small part of Los Angeles where you'd seen these kind of limited protests against ICE agents. On Sunday, things developed pretty quickly with the news that National Guard troops were being deployed. They were there to protect a federal building and federal personnel. That's their remit as National Guard troops there. But over the course of the afternoon and into the evening, the crowds of protesters just grew and grew. And there were what the mayor, Karen Bass, has called, some agitators, some opportunists, who took advantage of the situation into Sunday night. And there was violence. And those are the pictures that you have likely seen. So Waymo cars being set on fire. That continued into Monday, and this really escalating rhetoric between the president and the governor of California, which has been really interesting to watch. And now we've seen that 700 active duty Marines have also been deployed. They're also there in a helping capacity to protect federal personnel and buildings. So they're not engaging directly with protesters. Regardless, this has escalated very quickly.
Super clear. Thank you, Sumi. We should just say for people who've not been to LA, a Waymo, Gabriel, is a self-driving car. And there are a lot more of them on the streets of in the US than there are on the streets of the UK.
Are there any on the streets of the UK?
I think there's a few sort of trials.
Really?
But anyway.
I've never seen one.
Right. There's loads of things. Well, there's loads of things to unpick here. First of all, these big institutions that we're talking about here. ICE, for example, has got a kind of real mystique around it, hasn't it? It's a real sort of lightning rod.
Yeah, ICE is the federal agency that basically kicks out undocumented, enforces immigration rulings, basically. But at the moment, they're kind of these very high-profile raids to kick out undocumented immigrants, people who the government, for one reason or another, has decided should be gone.
And then the other big institution with the real mystique here is the National Guard. Just explain to us who they are and how they sort of fit into this.
Well, the National Guard, are usually deployed within the United States in sort of response to natural disasters, and since the 1960s have not been deployed against the wishes of the state governor, as is the case today. I think the last time this happened was during the Civil Rights era, in order to protect Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement and the integration of schools in the American South. So this is undoubtedly a huge deal, and the symbolic imagery of seeing the military on the streets of one of America's most iconic cities, not in response to a disaster, so Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, but in a law enforcement role, is quite chilling, I think.
And Sumi, just explain why this political battle between Donald Trump and the California governor, Gavin Newsom, is turning into just such a battle.
They've had plenty of tussles before, Gavin Newsom and Donald Trump. And, Gavin Newsom, as the governor of California, you will know, has been considered perhaps one of the front runners for the 2028 presidential race. He's certainly a star of the Democratic Party. So that adds perhaps to some of the tension that we've seen here. But, President Trump has said he likes Gavin Newsom, but thinks that he's a grossly incompetent governor. And if you go back to the LA wildfires, that's when this conflict we saw in Donald Trump's second term began again. We saw Donald Trump say that, there were questions about whether state aid would be delivered to Los Angeles. He's criticized the way that the governor has dealt with water management issues, for example. I'm mentioning this because when asked this time about these protests, he talks about the Los Angeles wildfires and previous what he calls mismanagement issues by this governor. And this war of words has been truly spectacular to behold, because it really has played out, as often these battles do now, on social media. So Governor Gavin Newsom has said that he told Donald Trump to stop, to not send troops, that the Los Angeles police has it under control. On the other hand, we see Donald Trump on social media say these are violent migrant riots and that they have to be essentially put down and the city has to be brought back under control. And on Monday, interesting, President Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, had been asked about whether he thinks the mayor, Karen Bass, and the governor, Gavin Newsom, whether they should be arrested. He was asked about whether elected officials should be detained if they are obstructing ICE agents or obstructing federal operations. And he said, no one's above the law. That was taken to mean that he was saying, that the governor of California could also be arrested. President Trump was asked about this, and he said, if I were Tom, I would do it. And that led to Gavin Newsom saying in an interview with MSNBC, okay, tough guy, you know where to find me, come arrest me. And we've just seen this continue to escalate on social media, battles between Governor Newsom and some of President Trump's allies, like his Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, where Gavin Newsom is pointing out that the January 6th riot, where the National Guard was not called in, January 6th, 2021, the attack on the Capitol. And so it has clearly gotten very heated between the two.
And we can hear a bit of Gavin Newsom responding to that.
The fear, the horror, the hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with. Tough guy. I don't give a damn. But I care about my community. I care about this community. The hell are they doing? These guys need to grow up. They need to stop. And we need to push back. And I'm sorry to be so clear, but that kind of bloviating is exhausting. So, Tom, arrest me. Let's go.
And Gabriel, that's a kind of good opportunity for Gavin Newsom, because he's been trying to present himself as a bit more of a tough guy and a bit less of like a California lefty the last few months, hasn't he?
I mean, clearly this whole situation has much, much, much more to do with politics than it has either to do with immigration or law enforcement or peace on the streets, right? The whole thing is politics. And it's interesting, Sumi, you referenced January the 6th, the riot at the Capitol, of course. Many on the liberal centre and left accuse those people involved in that of being insurrectionists. This is exactly the word that the MAGA people are now throwing at the people who are protesting and rioting in Los Angeles. So there's this kind of curious mirroring effect going on between these two warring camps in American politics, and this is really what this is all about.
Does it actually have any meaning then?
I mean, yes, it does, because I think that what we are seeing now is a culture war, essentially, teetering on the brink of being a real war. You know, people are talking about civil war in America, and I think it is that mood that, frankly, Donald Trump is trying to tap into. He is trying to portray himself not as the man who is sending in competent officials and agencies who can control a street disturbance. He is portraying himself as the man who can save America and everything it stands for from an internal enemy, a hard left internal enemy that is bent on destroying the United States.
And Sumi, is it your sense that this is morphing from an LA thing to a whole of America thing?
You are seeing protests pick up in other locations. There were protests, for example, in Dallas, protests in New York today, also announced here in Washington, D.C. You are getting a sense that people on both sides of the political side of the political aspect of this battle are starting to rally behind their camps. At the same time, Donald Trump and his administration see this very clearly as an issue they can win on. To Gabriel's point, for Donald Trump to portray himself as a law and order president, tough president, they are holding up the pictures of, the handful or dozen protesters or those who actually were violent on the streets of Los Angeles on Saturday and Sunday, who were detained. They're holding up those images as an example of why National Guard troops and the military need to be sent in. And Democratic governors actually unanimously signed a letter saying that they are extremely concerned about the precedent that this sets, because if the president is using this as an opportunity, in their words, to send in the military to states without their consent, they're concerned as to where this could head next. And to Gabriel's point, I mean, this is escalating as a political battle very quickly.
And there are also, I've noted in the last 12 hours or so, military veterans, veterans of the National Guard, very high-ranking officers, also expressing their fear about the politicization of the use of the military on American soil.
Also, Gabriel, do you think there's a little bit of Trump reacting to the old taco jibe from a couple of weeks ago? Trump always chickens out, which was in the kind of the trade context, but there's a kind of incentive for him to appear a bit tougher now as well, isn't there?
Maybe I don't spend enough time on X or whatever. I missed the taco jibe, but for sure he absolutely takes this as an opportunity to look tough, to perhaps change the narrative from the tariff stuff, which was kind of at the very least seen as kind of vacillating or indecisive or chaotic, if you like. This gives him an opportunity to show himself as somebody who's decisive and steps in. And as you say, Sumi, this is playing very much to his base and beyond, who see this as, undesirable. And the pictures, let's remember, the pictures that we see aren't necessarily representative of the whole of LA, right? We see pictures of things going up in smoke, people chucking stuff. Couple of blocks up, we know from when I've reported on these things, a couple of blocks up, everything can be absolutely fine. These can be isolated incidents, but on social media and indeed on the telly, it can look much bigger than it is.
And also there's just loads of old videos floating around where people are pretending they're from now.
That's right. And then
it's a completely different riot.
Oh my God. And then there's Grok AI
which
saying
is the AI on X.
On X, saying that pictures that were taken yesterday of the National Guard having to sleep on the floor of some hangar were in fact from 2021 in Afghanistan, which turned out not to be true. So the fog of disinformation and misinformation hangs heavy over LA.
But to the point of the opportunism of this moment that Gabriel was just making there, that was the first thing that Congressman Brad Sherman said to us. We spoke to on our programs. He's a congressman from California, from Los Angeles County, so not LA City proper. The area where the protests are taking place are not in his district. Regardless, his point was, look at what happened last week with this massive, spectacular blow up between Elon Musk and Donald Trump. Not a great news cycle for Donald Trump. Even the news that we saw about the big, beautiful bill that President Trump wants to get across the line, and that several senators have indicated they have some issues with. And then also even the news, which was pretty important on Friday, that we saw that Kilmer Abrego Garcia is back in the United States. I mean, Adam, this is a story we've talked about several times as well. They are charging him on human trafficking, but regardless, they had said very clearly he's never stepping back in the United States. So the accusation from Democrats is that this is President Trump trying to pivot and take over the news cycle again. That being said, it's a struggle for Democrats when you do see those pictures that Gabriel was referencing of these cars being torched, and some protesters, or as we said, opportunists, using violence and also kind of in these scuffles with police officers.
Now, let's hear the reaction to what's been going on in Los Angeles over the last few days from somebody who comes and goes regularly from MAGA world. It's Steve Bannon. Have a listen to this, and then Gabriel can explain to us why this intervention is important or not. And this is friend of Newscast Katrina Perry, speaking to Steve Bannon in the last day or so.
Do you think the president was right to override the rights of the state in terms of making its own decisions, and in this case he chose to send in the National Guard?
That's a miss. I come from Richmond, Virginia, so I know something about states' rights. And Gavin Newsom is acting like a neo-Confederate right now. The federal government has every availability to do what they did to federalize National Guards, particularly if they think of the commander-in-chief thinks that something's not being handled properly, and that's what the president did. Our argument today on the show is that he should double and triple down today with ICE raids.
Right, Gabriel, you need to be an American nerd to understand most of what Steve Bannon was saying there. So let's park all the details. Where is Steve Bannon now in relation to Donald Trump? Because in the first term, for the first bit of the first term, he was right there in the Oval Office. Then he was sort of cast out into outer darkness. And then now he was set up as a sort of rival to Elon Musk. Elon Musk seems to have gone. Is this Steve Bannon back now? What does it mean for what who Trump is now?
Well, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head there, Adam. I mean, basically, MAGA is a coalition, and Steve Bannon heads the nativist wing of it, if you like, the wing of MAGA, the
kind of classic America first.
Yeah, that sees Make America Great Again as Make America 1950s America again, right? Where there are, jobs for life in the Rust Belt, or not the Rust Belt, the gleaming steel belt, as it were, the kind of bit of MAGA that sort of sometimes skirts on, white nationalism and that kind of thing. When America was right, and you heard him reference, the Confederacy, accusing Gavin Newsom of being a neo-Confederate in that clip there. Very interesting. It's kind of flipping the narrative on its head. And again, this is the language of civil war. This is the language of very, very...
Because the Confederacy was the southern states in
right,
Civil War.
Right. So we're beyond kind of making politics here. Now, so Steve Bannon heads that wing of MAGA, which is Make America Great Again, with like jobs for life and big protections and kind of prosperity for blue-collar workers. And that's the kind of MAGA of the Trump base, if you like. There's the other wing of MAGA, which is like the tech bro, Silicon Valley oligarch wing of the movement that perhaps was most embodied by Elon Musk, but has various other kind of quite high-profile Silicon Valley types in it, such as Peter Thiel and various others. And the bust-up with Musk, the big, beautiful bust-up, if you like, over the big, beautiful bill, seemed to suggest that wing, the hyper-libertarian, small government wing, which is really in contradiction to the Bannon wing of Make America Great Again, had lost some ground. And it does feel like Bannon's star, as you said, which waxes and wanes, is waxing.
And then Sumi, where are we with the Trump Elon Musk relationship now. And at moments like this, I always say, are we at DEFCON 1 or DEFCON 5? And then I realise I don't know if DEFCON 1 is worse than 5, but you choose whichever metaphor you want to explain where we've got to after the big bust up. Yeah.
1 is worse than 5.
Is that right? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. What's DEFCON 5? It's just like, nah, well...
Watchfulness.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway.
A normal state of alert, I guess. It's interesting. President Trump has, in several conversations, said he's just ready to move on. And I was talking to Bob Costa, who's CBS's chief Washington analyst and knows President Trump well, has covered him for years. I had a phone call with him on Friday after this entire dust-up with Elon Musk and said, look, the president doesn't actually seem to be thinking that much about this. He's a little disappointed in Elon. And when President Trump was asked again about it, he said, well, if he calls me, let's see what happens. It seemed to open the door a little bit to the possibility of these two men talking again in the future. We know that President Trump really liked having the world's richest man by his side and did think that Elon Musk is brilliant as a businessman. I mean, so there might possibly be some opportunity for them to at least connect again in the future. But as of now, it seems like President Trump has kind of written him off as an ally in the short term. Whether they can come together again in the long term, the fact that Elon Musk deleted his tweet about President Trump being in the Epstein files does perhaps indicate that he is trying to dial down the tensions a little bit. And now that the dust has settled quite a little bit over the last few days, it could be that you see the two camps try to reestablish their relationship, at least in some form.
And Gabriel, just lastly on this, did the falling out between Trump and Musk play out how you thought it would do?
Yeah, it did. I mean, it was always evident, I think, from the beginning that two overgrown children with massive egos sharing one oval-shaped office was...
As some people might perceive them.
As some people might perceive them. Other opinions are available in other quarters. But that's kind of how I see them. Certainly with the massive egos, sharing one oval-shaped office was never going to end well. And I think also in the short term, it was always going to be clear who was going to come out as the bigger swinger in this, because the office belongs to the president. And it was always going to be Trump, I think, that in the short term at least, was going to come out winning from that clash. What happens in the medium term, I think, is a bigger question. But those two wings, just to go back to that idea, the Bannon wing and the Musk wing of MAGA, are basically in contradiction with each other, and this is a kind of battle for the soul of the movement.
And Gabriel, while you were talking there, I was listening, but I was multitasking because I also looked up what DEFCON 5 is, and according to, well, actually, this is the AI answer, so I should probably double check it, but we're reading it out. It says DEFCON 5 represents a state of peacetime readiness, which is considered the normal and sustained level of preparedness.
Right, so
there we go.
It would be interesting to, are they, what DEFCON are they actually at in LA right now? Maybe somebody can tell us.
I don't know if it is on a state, but I think it's a national thing rather than a state-by-state thing. Anyway, there's a whole series of podcasts we could do about that. Gabriel, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And Sumi, good to catch up with you too.
Great to talk to you.
Now, one of the themes in the build-up to the spending review has been the government previewing some big infrastructure investments they're going to make. Do you remember the extension of the metro to Washington in Tyne and Wear last week on Newscast? Well, today, the Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband, did another one. He announced £14.2 billion of government money to build the Sizewell C nuclear power plant in Suffolk. The government says this new nuclear reactor will generate enough power to heat 6 million homes and will create 10,000 new jobs. And, well, it's a lot of money. So why is the government doing this, and what does this mean for our future energy needs? We can discuss it now with Adam Bell, who's the former head of energy strategy at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and is now Director of Policy at the consultancy Stonehaven. Hello, Adam.
Hello, happy to be here.
Lovely to see you. Two ads is better than one.
I thoroughly agree.
Well, let's find out, shall we? Right. What has the government actually announced today?
So what the government has announced today is a very large package of funding for Sizewell C. Sizewell C, as the name implies, is the third nuclear plant that is now going to be built at Sizewell in Suffolk. It is not an announcement of what's known in the trade as the final investment decision. That will happen later on. But what it is basically an announcement that it's going to happen. There's enough cash to bring in other cash to build the plant.
Right, so we actually can't say that the price tag of this is going to be 14 billion. This is just a sort of a bit of seed money.
Well, I describe it less seed money and more and literally planting trees in the ground money. It is a lot of cash and it'll bring in more, but it's not the final price tag. That will be determined by the amount of investment they need to construct and to build and to operate the plant, which will be a higher number. Only the government currently knows that number.
And when do we think this final investment will all be sealed up?
I would assume, if not by the end of June, then certainly early July. It'll happen before recess.
Right. Oh, and then it'll get announced again.
Well, obviously, 2 announcements for the price of 1.
But we don't know which companies will be involved in the actual next bit of the building.
No, so, the way in which it will work, there's a consortium, the Sizewell C consortium, which is now essentially half owned by government. Investors will take a stake in that consortium. They'll put in cash. The contracts for construction will then be let, and we will then know who's going to start building it. But it will be a mix of different major infrastructure contractors who, quite frankly, have worked on nuclear before, have worked in Hinkley C, and have the skills we need to build the plant.
And then the government thinks they could have this up and running in the mid-2030s. Is that a realistic time frame for these things?
So Hinkley C, the predecessor to Sizewell C, has taken a lot longer than that. But that's
the one in Somerset.
Yes, that's the one in Somerset. But that was, in all fairness, the first of a kind. Sizewell C is essentially an almost identical copy of it. It's got some changes based on its location and some minor updates based on additional kind of safety parameters. But all that means essentially is that you're stamping out the same thing you've done before. So you should be able to do it faster. And we are testing kind of the theory of nuclear fleet deployment now in real time.
Oh, so when government ministers say, "Oh, it won't go over budget and over time like Hinkley Point C," that you kind of believe them.
I think there are good
doing
grounds
the same
to believe
again.
it.
I think that's credible.
Yes, but there's always ways in which things can go wrong. But my assumption is, given that they've done it once, and by the end of this decade, we'll have Hinkley C, at least one reactor up and running. There's a reasonable grounds to believe Sizewell C will be on time and on budget, assuming that we learn all the lessons that we learned from Hinkley C.
And how much energy will this thing be churning out when it is built?
So 3.3 gigawatts, which is equivalent to about 6 or 7 million homes. It's a very, very large chunk of the nation we powered by this power plant alone. I think this is really where the case for large-scale nuclear comes in. It covers off so much of our energy demand all at once from a single site, which makes it much easier to, if you're sitting in the centre of government, to forecast exactly where you're going to get your power from in the future. It's important to bear in mind why we're doing this. It is about climate change, but it's also about all the other drivers in power demand. People buying electric cars, people buying heat pumps and other electrically driven devices. That will massively increase power demand. It'll massively increase power demand to such an extent that there'll be a higher proportion of electricity demand that is always on. And nuclear, much like that demand, is always on because you don't really want switching nuclear power stations on and off.
And that's an interesting way of putting it, because I think with our focus on what the energy mix is going to be, which is going to be fossil fuels dialing down, renewables dialing up quite quickly, we sort of forget that the overall pie is going to have to be bigger too, because there will be so many more devices using electricity. And I think sometimes I forget that about the future.
Yes, this is the thing. We have to build a lot of almost everything in order to have a reasonable chance of decarbonising. So you need nuclear, you need wind, you need solar, you need batteries, you need pumped hydro, you need all the imaginative things that we're going to have in the future. You might even need fusion if we can get it ready in time.
And there's this thing that they talk about, base load, which is just the amount of energy you need in the system at all times. And if you only had wind power, then there might be a day where there's no wind and you'd have no baseload. So is this kind of the insurance policy to make sure the lights are always on?
So it's unfortunately slightly more complicated.
Yay!
But I'll make this as clear as I can. Certainly, there is a chunk of energy that you always need, and that you always need to keep the lights on. You'll never lower your demand below a certain number, and that number, that lower bound number, will only increase from here on in. At the same time, however, there's a lot of demand that comes on during the day, and from people going to work, from people plugging different sorts of things in, that you need to have what are called dispatchable plants. So plants you can turn up and turn down and switch off. Historically, what we've done is we've had plants like gas that you can turn up during the day and then turn down at night. And that's worked reasonably well. It's quite simple. What we have in the future is something a little bit more complicated, because on top of that base load, a lot of which will come from nuclear, you have a mix of wind and solar and batteries and other forms of stores. The wind will produce power, or in some cases a lot more than we need. That power will go into batteries, and the batteries will then send the energy back to the grid, normally around tea time. You see this in California already, where the grid is already more decarbonised than us. Solar is used during the day, it goes into batteries, and around in the evening, when people come home, they start cooking, they turn on the lights. There's a massive surge of output from batteries. That is what our grid will look like in the future. And nuclear will chunder away alongside the bottom, keeping everything else running.
Right. I also suspect that we're like closer to all this battery storage being deployed than a lot of us realize. Because to me, battery storage still seems like a bit of a sort of sci-fi thing. But you're talking about it as it's just around the corner.
Oh, it's already happening. I mean, we've already got the kind of first transmission scale battery connected up in Scotland. We've got about 5 gigawatts of batteries in system already. As a reminder, Sizewell C is going to be 3.3 gigawatts. So there's a lot of the stuff coming on. By 2030, we expect to have 20 to 25 gigawatts in the system. They're less visible, obviously, because essentially, if you go to a battery plant, they look like shipping containers. It's essentially long rows of sheds, but they can store a large amount of energy. And because lithium batteries have come down in price so much, they're now incredibly cheap. We don't subsidize batteries; they pay for themselves.
I'm also glad you get Sizewell C and Hinkley Point C mixed up too, because I always get them mixed up. But then the easy way to remember it is like Sizewell C, the one we're talking about today, starts with an S and it's in Suffolk, which starts with an S. That's my little mnemonic. Anyway, so tell me the backstory then of Sizewell C, because I mean Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, has been kind of joking today when he's been on various other podcasts and radio shows that he kind of signed off Sizewell C when he was an energy minister the first time round, when Gordon Brown was prime minister. So this has been in the works for a long time.
It has. So if I can, and please forgive me going as far back in time, I want to take a quick trip back to the 1980s, when the government was last making a decision on Sizewell B. This was in
Suffolk.
Yes, again, in Suffolk on the same site. This was off the back of building about 1 or 2 nuclear power stations every decade since the 50s. The UK had the first commercial nuclear power station at Calder Hall. However, by the 80s, nuclear power was starting to fall out of favour on 2 grounds. Firstly, concerns about radiation post-Chernobyl were very high. And secondly, the sheer cost of Britain's reactor fleet was becoming apparent. We'd picked our own design, which no one else had bought, and it was proving tricky to keep operational, tricky to keep running. But so we just made the decision at the start of the 1980s that instead of building our own design, what was called an advanced gas-cooled reactor design, we were instead going to build an American design called a pressurized water reactor. I could go into details about how all these work, but it's not necessary for the purpose of the story. But Sizewell B, coming as it did at the tail end of all this concern about nuclear, was subject to an incredibly lengthy public inquiry that lasted years and took in vast amounts of evidence and took forever to reach a decision, something that will be familiar to many builders of infrastructure today. Ultimately, this pushed back Sizewell B's completion date from the 1980s into well into the 90s. It became the last reactor that we built. And the sheer grinding experience of doing that, alongside the cheap gas that we were getting from the North Sea, which is powering a new fleet of gas turbines, meant that the government in the early 90s, which was then the Conservatives, specifically said, we're not doing nuclear anymore, we're just doing gas. And that consensus essentially lingered right up until post-2005. When all the parties started to realise, we actually need quite a lot of power to do this decarbonisation thing. And we're building wind, but we're also going to need nuclear. And so going back to Ed Miliband's first turn in what is now the DESNZ chair, the government's started a process in motion to identify ways of supporting new nuclear power stations that will be built without public ownership, because all the other power stations have been built by the nationalised system. And that then did end up the process called electricity market reform, which gave us a framework called contracts for difference, which are how we've built so much offshore wind.
And just to interrupt, contracts for difference is when basically the government says to a renewable energy operator, here's a guaranteed price that we will pay for the electricity from your wind farm, so that it's always kind of profitable and makes sense for that wind farm to be built and to be operated.
Exactly. And contracts are different. They were designed for nuclear, have been very, very successful at delivering large volumes of renewables as well. So post Hinkley C, the idea was that these we built at the same time. Hinkley C was signed off, and the option for Sizewell C was given to the UK government. As time went on, as we started building our Hinkley C, we looked again at Sizewell C, and we've slowly, over the last decade, decided, yes, we'd like to buy 2 after all. So we've made 1 decision on nuclear power per decade. I'm hoping we can accelerate that process now.
What a tangled tale. So actually there is a parallel universe where Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C were given the go-ahead at the same time, and the overall cost for both could have been less than staggering the decision over decades.
Well, that's not clear, because you do learn and you do take lessons from Hinkley C to Sizewell C. If you built them both at the same time, you need double the workforce, which, given that nuclear engineers are expensive, could have been pricey too. What would almost certainly have been cheaper is to have not paused a nuclear build program in the 90s and kept it going. Because I think this is one of the most important things about today's announcement. If we're to build nuclear power in the future, we need engineers who are familiar with the particular challenges associated with working with radiation, the challenges associated with a nuclear reactor. We kind of lost all those skills when we gave up our nuclear build-out. That means we've rediscovered them via Hinkley C. We'll deploy them again for Sizewell C. And as government wants to do, if you want to build out more smaller reactors, like the Rolls-Royce design that's just gotten approval today, you will almost certainly want to retain that sort of nuclear skill base. If we hadn't done Sizewell C, it's difficult to see how you do the rest of nuclear.
And you mentioned the small modular reactors, which, I mean, has been a sort of recurring phrase throughout the whole time I've covered politics in Britain. When are we actually going to see these like mini nuclear power plants being built?
So Rolls-Royce today were very, very bullish. They think they can build one at pace. They believe they can get one done by the end of the decade. That is very, very ambitious. The assumption is, for your listeners, a small modular reactor is actually not really that small. For a start, one of the reactors that we're talking about is about 560 megawatts, which is about the size of one of the existing reactors at Hinkley, one of the older Hinkley B reactors. The difference is they're modular, which means in theory you can make all the parts off-site and kind of just put them all together. You can manufacture them at scale. And in theory, again, they should hurl down costs even more. The government has essentially said we're going to build about 3 of these SMRs at sites around the country. The sites have yet to be identified. We're hoping to see a little bit more detail on that soon. At the same time, to complicate things further, there's an entirely third category of nuclear. Well, there's others, but this is the most interesting one, which are micro modular reactors. Right. And these are very, very small devices, equivalent to about 20 megawatt of electrical output. So as a point of comparison, that's about the kind of demand from a very, very small town, almost a village. And these are about the size of a shipping container. And these are intended to be mass deployable, so you can build stacks of them and put them wherever you want. The government has talked about this for quite some time. They're talking about a private route for delivering those. How that's going to work in practice is unclear, which is a shame because they're an excellent way of providing heat for low-carbon heat networks, though I've yet to find anyone who wants to live next to one.
Indeed. And then last question on this. Because people always start thinking about this when we have this conversation. Nuclear waste, like, okay, that's a whole podcast in itself, but have we found like a really safe, cost-effective way of dealing with all this stuff that's left over?
So we have what's called a geological disposal facility that is currently being considered for development under Cumbria, much like the one the Finns have already built to take the waste from Okalutu, which I may have mispronounced. Essentially, it's a series of tunnels dug far, far beneath the earth that are intended to hold waste in secure lead-lined caskets for the millions of years it will take for them to fully degrade. There's enough space in that geological disposal facility to hold hundreds of years worth of waste from our planned nuclear sites. So that feels solved, although of course burying things deep beneath the earth may to some not appear to be a solution. But short of firing it into the sun, it is certainly the most cost-effective way of doing it.
And cost-effective isn't the same as cheap.
Yeah,
because it is expensive. And then just before you go, spending review tomorrow, do you want to give us something to look out for in the spending review when it comes to the energy area?
So certainly, I think the big question for tomorrow is how much the government is going to spend on heat decarbonisation, so supporting heat pumps, especially, because that is kind of the big unanswered question of decarbonisation. We've got kind of a plan for cars. EVs are quite popular now. You can go out and buy one relatively easily. We've got a plan for power, but heat's the thing that is about a third of our emissions, much less so. Heat pumps have not taken off in the way in which they were meant to. They're still going to need a lot of support, and that has to come from the taxpayer. It's very, very difficult to see a world in which government signs up to essentially charging people a lot extra for their boilers. So that means a bunch of cash needs to come out tomorrow if it have a chance of meeting that target.
And by support, you basically mean a subsidy so that when somebody buys a heat pump, they're not paying the cost price.
Yes, there's currently a scheme called the Boiler Upgrade Scheme, which is exactly as it sounds. You can get $7,500 for replacing your boiler with a heat pump. I've done it myself. It didn't make the heat pump cheap. It made it cost about $8,000 rather than $15,000. That's still a lot more money than a boiler, and that's something government needs to tackle.
Adam, thank you very much.
Always happy to talk about atoms.